During the worst part of the pandemic, when it wasn't possible to meet in person, one of the things I missed the most was just getting together with a friend for coffee and talking. When I discovered the podcast Wild Precious Life from Annmarie Kelly, I realized how lonely I had been. Annmarie interviews such interesting people, musicians, writers, entrepreneurs, and people just taking their own path in this world. She opens up the conversation to where I feel like I'm sitting there at the table with them, with my steaming cup of tea in front of me, just nodding along. I believe that conversation is an art and is the most effective mode of communication that we have. If you want to hear someone who practices this art beautifully in a way that is inclusive and curious and courageous, join me in joining Annmarie Kelly for her podcast Wild Precious Life. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Stick around to the end of the episode to hear more about Wild Precious Life. The episode you're about to hear is part of our Season 2 series on family. Whether family of origin or family of choice, is your work a family affair? Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work. Many years ago, a very good friend of mine had her first child. She had been looking forward to having some time at home with her new baby. A few weeks after giving birth, she suddenly came back to work. I asked her why, and she said she had been so lonely. Every day, she would get the baby dressed and go to the park, just hoping that she would find another new mom to talk with. When I had my own children a few years later, I thought back on that story a lot. I've never felt so isolated in my life as I did when I was home with my very small children. I used to wonder, how can I be with the people I love most in the world and feel so lonely? My guest on this episode is Laura Joyce Davis, creator and host of the podcast Shelter in Place. This award-winning podcast began as a way to help Laura stay grounded when she learned that the schools in the Oakland School District were shutting, with students ordered to stay home when the pandemic protocols went into place in the Bay Area. She knew that in order to feel fulfilled, she needed a creative project to get her through this period of being home with her 3 young children. Her idea was brilliant. Create a daily podcast to get her through the couple of weeks of shelter-in-place protocols the school system was implementing. There was one thing she didn't foresee. Oakland schools would be closed for a year. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. Laura Joyce Davis is the host and founder of the podcast Shelter in Place. Laura kept her commitment to release a daily podcast for a phenomenally long time, resulting in 100 episodes in Season 1. She shared a year of some incredibly challenging upheavals for her family that so many people experienced during the pandemic. As a result of this sharing, Laura did something really remarkable. She created a community around her podcast at a time when people really needed community. Laura continues to create a weekly show now. Her husband, Nate Davis, joined her as creative director of the podcast. Today, they run the Kasama Collective, which is a podcast training program for female and non-binary audio storytellers. They also offer Kasama Labs, a self-paced online course for audio storytelling. In 2021, Shelter in Place won an International Women's Podcasting Award. In our conversation, Laura and I talk about motherhood and the need to also be a creative person to really fulfill our purpose. We also talk about that terrible gremlin, perfectionism, that can prevent a lot of creative people from sharing their work and themselves with others. Before we meet today's guest, I want to tell you about an app called Newsly. Newsly is an all-in-one audio super app for iOS and Android. There really hasn't been an app like Newsly before now. Newsly picks up all of the trending articles on the web and reads them to you in a natural human voice. You can find any topic you're interested in, sports, politics, or art. I've loved using this app. I listen to it when I'm commuting or when I'm gardening or while I'm cooking, anytime where I want to catch a little bit of news, but my hands are full or I can't stop to read. You can also find trending podcasts from over 50 countries on Newsly, including Art Heals All Wounds. Newsly has become my go-to listening app for podcasts. If you want to try Newsly yourself, just download it from www.newsly.me. And if you use the promo code ARTHEALS, you'll get a free 1-month premium subscription. I'll include all of this info in the show notes so that you can just click on the link and use the Art Heals promo to get your free trial. Now, let's meet this week's guest. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Could you start by introducing yourself, telling us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I am Laura Joyce Davis, and I'm the host and creator of the podcast Shelter in Place, which is a narrative nonfiction podcast about reimagining life through creativity and community. I'm also a lifelong fiction writer. I'm a mom with 3 young children who are all still in the single digits. And I'm the founder and president of the Kasama Collective, which is a podcast training program, a training intensive for women and non-binary audio storytellers. And then just as of 2022, I am also the director of the Kasama Labs, which is basically a self-paced version of the Kasama Collective. And we give people a creative toolkit in mastering the art and science of audio storytelling, is how we put it. So that's just happening as we're having this conversation. I'm very exciting.
That's such an amazing list of what you're doing in your life. And I think it might be hard for people to imagine that you started podcasting only in 2020. And this name of this term, shelter in place, is indelibly a part of our vocabulary around the pandemic. I would love to hear how you started podcasting. What was your intent? What were you doing in the beginning? How did this all start?
Yeah, it's funny. My relationship with that term, shelter in place, it's a complicated one at this point. We've actually thought about changing the name, but that's another story. So March of 2020, I think the best way that I can introduce the origin story of Shelter in Place is really to bring you into that moment of, really, it was March 16th, 2020, when my husband Nate and I learned that our 3 kids were going to be home from school for at least 2 weeks. We thought that we had probably 3 weeks with them because spring break was coming up after that. And I kind of had this freak out moment where I was like, what am I going to do with all 3 kids home, 5 days a week? And my husband was still commuting to work at that point, so he wasn't around for that. And I think to really understand that freak out, you have to go back a little bit further in really what has been my journey as a mother and a creative for the last now almost 10 years. And, I didn't know a lot about podcasting when I came into Shelter in Place at the beginning, but I did know a lot about writing. I got my MFA in fiction at Mills College, right here in Oakland. That's why we moved to Oakland back in 2004. And since then had been seriously writing, in some shape or form, novels, short stories, putting stuff out there in magazines. But really most of those years from when I graduated in 2006 to 2020, a lot of that time was spent parenting. And, just the way that it kind of worked out in that season of life, it made more sense for my husband to be the one doing the full-time job. And I would do freelance work and stuff like that. But it was really the larger responsibilities of parenting mostly fell to me in those years. And I want to say up front, I love my children. I adore them. I'm so grateful to be a mother. I don't take that for granted. And also, motherhood was never for me the thing that was going to feed my soul. And I felt really guilty about that for a long time because, especially when I had babies, I had a lot of people in my life who were very joyful stay-at-home moms and who, that was kind of the thing that they had wanted their whole lives. And here I was so grateful to be a mom, but also just feeling kind of lacking in some way that, why wasn't this time with my children making me feel so fulfilled? And why did I feel bored, honestly, with so much of those years? And, it's like I think more we're talking about this in the world of just motherhood being more complex than I think maybe we've been led to believe for especially a lot of people of my generation. I'm in my 40s, so, I can date myself there. But I think a really important part of that creative journey for me as a mother was realizing that it didn't make me a bad mom, that I was at my best as a mother when I was creating something. And that in fact, when I gave myself permission to do that, it was a great gift to my children. They got to see this side of me that was not just mom, but writer and creator and, now entrepreneur. And so I think it's a complicated conversation to have, right? I mean, I understand that being a mom, so much of it is like, you just have to show up and you got to feed them and you've got to get them naps and all those things. And I did those things. But I think if I am being perfectly honest here, a lot of those years were also filled with a lot of mental health struggles for me. I was really depressed during, not, constantly, but definitely had my seasons of that. I also had a miscarriage during that time between kids 2 and 3 that just knocked me sideways in a way that I was not prepared for. And so creativity for me, I think even before Shelter in Place, has become this thing where, I love the title of your podcast, Art Heals All Wounds. And I think writing for me, and now podcasting, where the writing is still very much central in that, it has healed many wounds for me. And I suspect that it will continue to heal my wounds for the rest of my life. Maybe not completely heal them, but help me to at least address them and grow from them and maybe hopefully become a more whole person because of that creativity and that healing process. So back to Shelter in Place, March 17th, 2020 was the first day of the Bay Area Shelter in Place orders. I had come up with the idea for the podcast literally the day before. This was not something that I thought I would be doing for more than a couple of weeks. And you've heard me tell this story before, but I went on a bike ride on the 16th. I got one of these flashes of inspiration, like, you sometimes do as a creator, and you recognize those moments as special. And the idea was this: I would write a daily podcast where each episode was essentially a personal essay. I would put aside all of the perfectionism that I had learned, not just as a creative, but especially as a creative in literary fiction, where you do, 15, 16, 17 drafts of a novel before you even send it out. I would just put all of that aside and I would say, okay, I'm going to write one draft of this episode. I'm going to record it in one take and I'm going to push publish. That was the idea. And I thought, I'll do this daily, not 5 days a week, but 6 days a week. I'll do it Monday through Saturday. And this will take me maybe an hour a day, and I had kids home during this time, right? This wasn't like I had endless time. And I genuinely believed this was possible. I came home from that bike ride. I was talking to my husband, Nate, I'm like, listen to my idea. What do you think? And he was like, yeah, I think you should do it. I think this sounds like a great idea. he understood me and knew me well enough at that point to know what I was up against having the kids home. What he did not know is that within those first 2 weeks, well, first of all, of course, it didn't just take me an hour and an hour a day. I think I only did that maybe once. And very quickly, it became a full-time job for me. And at the same time, he, like many people in this pandemic, got laid off from his job within the first 2 weeks. And so he was working at the time for a construction company who was doing copywriting for them. He's an advertising copywriter by trade. And their, construction was one of the industries that just totally got hit and put on pause. And so they had to say, like, sorry, we don't have any work for you right now because we're not working. And so that was a pretty big shift overnight. I mean, we went from him being the one working full time, me mostly being with the kids, to completely flipping roles. So he became the person who was doing almost all of the childcare. And then I became the person who was doing almost all, not paid work at that point, but it was work. And so what I did not know when I started was that not only would that happen, but one by one, the pieces of our life that had felt really secure before the pandemic would just kind of start to crumble. We had for about 10 years been planning a trip to Mexico. And the reason that I actually, not just a trip, but to move there for a year. And the reason that I knew anything at all about podcasting was I had been working on another podcast that never ended up getting out in the world. Maybe it will someday still, but it was all about U.S.-Mexico immigration. I had done 21 interviews. I had actually submitted the pilot episode to the WNYC Podcast Accelerator contest in September of 2019 and was a finalist. So I was learning, but I didn't know how to edit audio. I didn't know sound design, all of those things I would learn later. And I would learn them really in the course of doing those season 1 episodes, which I did keep up amazingly. It's amazing even to me that I was able to keep them up just barely. But I ended up doing 100 episodes in season 1, Monday through Saturday. I think I even put them out on holidays. Gosh. I mean, I look back and I think just, oh my goodness, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But I'm also not sorry. I think there was something for me about needing to show up for the work every day and facing my own lifelong sort of obsession with perfectionism and making the work really, really great. And I had to just let that go every single day because you can't make it perfect when you're doing a daily and you have no lead time. And then in the midst of all of that, I was giving myself an education in audio, which was so much more fun than I ever thought it would be. I found that I really love audio editing. I really love sound design. I really love all of the different parts of the podcast production process. And because I was doing it all by myself that first season for 100 episodes in a row, I had to learn really fast. I made a lot of mistakes and then I learned how to fix them. And, that I mentioned at the beginning, the Kasama Collective and the Kasama Labs, I think the reason we are able to set up the course in the way that we are is because of that experience, because I learned very quickly what doesn't work and what does. And also what I needed as a creator to be able to create really great work, but not have it take you months and months to do one episode.
Well, it's so interesting. So many thoughts bubbled up into my head while you were talking. One thing that I experienced as a mom of very small children was an intense sense of isolation and loneliness. And you talk about boredom, and it does make you feel like a terrible mom to admit that, hanging out with your 6-month-old or playing blocks with your 1.5-year-old doesn't fulfill you. But there's a lot of time being a mom where you're bored and you're starved for contact that isn't your own child at whatever very young developmental age they are. And I feel like I can't help but notice the link between your kids all coming back home and this idea that we're about to go into this time of isolation. And I also do remember that I thought we'd be home for a couple of months and that the pandemic would be done. So I was a little bit further than you, but not much, And so I think I'm an older mom than you. I am a Gen Xer. You might be an older millennial or a young Gen Xer.
I'm a young Gen Xer. I was 1979. Yep.
Okay.
I think that makes me a Gen Xer, right? Pretty sure.
I think it does. Yeah. And I don't think, for sure, when I was a young mom, these conversations were not happening about this identity of motherhood and that what would it mean if you weren't fulfilled by that. And I don't know if you have more to say about this need for connection, or if that was a similar feeling to you and an impetus in creating the podcast, or if it was just the need to create. And I have other questions about the perfectionism. If you feel like you've kind of said everything you need to say about this role between motherhood and being a creative person.
I mean, there's so much to say, right? We could have a whole conversation just on that. I think in terms of the need for connection, it's bigger than motherhood for me at this point. I think one of the things I've deeply appreciated about podcasting that I do think is different from any other medium I can think of is that there's this intimacy to it and this connection that you get weirdly, even though in some ways it's a one-way medium. I mean, I think on the flip side of that, nothing brightens my day or makes my week more than to hear from listeners and to hear that somebody really engaged with and appreciated something that we put out there. But the strange thing to me is that, and maybe this is because Shelter in Place is so, it's a memoir podcast. We have many, many interviews, about 2/3 to a half, somewhere in there, include interviews, but it's narrative nonfiction. So there's a lot of, even the interview episodes are still, there's a narrative written around that and things are moved around. And so it's very much a story arc in every episode. And I think because I was putting myself out there in this very personal narrative way and have continued to, we're now in our 3rd season and over 180 episodes later. But I think because of that, I have found that if you listen to those episodes, I mean, especially for the people who've listened to a lot of them, you actually know me quite well. That's not fake. That's like you're getting the real deal Laura Joyce Davis. And it's not only the real me, but it's in some ways almost the truest version of me because it's the me that I've thought a lot about. And I'm, right. It's not all flattering. And, there are moments that I share where I've been a little embarrassed about those moments, but I've chosen to put them out there because I know that sometimes you just need to hear that somebody else is struggling. And that is the thing that I am so fascinated by this medium, how you can have this person on a podcast talking about their life and sharing what they're going through. And somehow a listener across the world who they've never met can feel connected to that person. And I think before I did this work, I would have said, well, that's a one-way connection. And I actually don't think that anymore. I think it's what keeps me going as a podcaster is knowing that people are connecting. And even, when I get to hear about it, that's amazing. I love that. I love hearing from people. But even if I don't, even if I know that people are still listening and that connection is somehow there, which is just sort of, it's a little mysterious to me still that it's possible, but it does feel like, I mean, maybe the best way to put it is I have a few people in my life, actually my parents are among them, which means so much to me, but who've listened to every single one of the episodes that we've put out. And like I said, it's over like 180 episodes. It's a lot of hours in the world of, my voice and my stories and my conversations. And my mom said to me recently, she said, I feel like I know you better than I used to because I've been listening to your podcast. And I said, yeah, I think that's actually true. You do. Because my soul is in that podcast. Like you're getting the me that doesn't always make it out in everyday life. And that is precious. It's amazing to me that that's possible, but I do think it's different than other mediums that I know of. And so, yeah, that connection piece, that's definitely there. And I think it's it's there in the obvious ways, like when you hear from listeners, but it's also there in the not obvious ways. It's definitely made me feel less lonely and alone in this pandemic.
Mm. Yeah. And I feel that when I listen to your podcast. I do feel about podcasts as a listener that there's something incredibly intimate about. Usually I listen to a podcast on my headphones, and there are times when someone is telling you their story and you do feel like they are really speaking to you and they're sharing something with you. So even though it may feel like a one-way street, it's very interactive, I find, as a listener, because you do have to, it's like sitting down for a cup of tea with someone and they're going to tell you some really intimate story and you're there to listen. So I think it is an incredibly engaging medium and a great way to share. And I do feel that way about your episodes. I don't feel like I'm listening to some sort of fake, I'm going to dazzle you with, the most clever, packaging of this story that I can.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And I think it's, it depends on the podcast, right? I think obviously there are podcasts where that's not the case, but it just occurred to me as you were talking, maybe I love podcasting so much for the same reason that I love the friendships that are really close in my life. And that is, I've never been a surface person. Like I don't have a ton of patience for small talk. And the friendships that have endured in my life are the ones where even if I haven't talked to the person in years, we can get to a real deep level very fast because there's just kind of that built-in assumption that we care about each other and we respect each other and we really want to hear what's going on, not just the surface level answer. And I think podcasting at its best gives you that, or it can anyway. And that's certainly what I try to achieve, I think, in whatever episodes we're doing of Shelter in Place, whether or not it's primarily my voice or somebody else's. I always try to get that feel of sitting down with a really good friend and hopefully getting something from it that's encouraging, but also not glossing over the hard parts of life. And, that balance that we all live with of holding the pain and the joy sometimes exactly at the same time.
But, sharing vulnerabilities is the key to making a friend. You can't really make a friend if you don't share your vulnerabilities. So, and when you do that, you're giving your friend a gift. So I think that approach to podcasting has really served you well. People feel like they're going to get an authentic sort of, where is Laura this week? And what is she thinking about? Experience. I do want to go back to something you brought up earlier, which is this idea of perfectionism. I've heard you talk about it a little bit, and I want to ask you, what role does it play in your life? This idea of needing what you're creating to be perfect.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I think perfectionism gets a little bit of a bad rap. Like, I don't think it's actually all bad. This was something that I just kind of came to recently because it is a struggle for me. And I'll talk about that. I don't mind talking about that. But I do think that my own perfectionism, when I think about where it came from, it's actually a very good place for the most part. I was raised by parents who were both the first in their families to go to college and did not come from money and really in many ways came from struggle. My dad his parents, who are now both dead, they were farmers in a very, very small town in Nebraska. And my mom grew up on the Mexican border in McAllen, Texas. And, my only surviving grandparent is my grandmother, who's now 99. She lives with my parents now. And, my grandmother, I interviewed her recently, and I knew this about her, but it was a really interesting reminder to just remember she had a husband who worked, but it sounds like the work was kind of inconsistent. And so she spent a lot of the years when she raised my mom and her two brothers working at Sears and, just supporting the family that way. And So for both of my parents, they both came to college, not just as the first in their families, but very much with the vision of kind of escaping. I don't know if I want to say poverty, but I think it might have been close to that, actually, from what I know about my grandparents' lives. And it's also this very American thing, right? I think this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And I think as I've gotten older, I've really seen the holes in that what my parents experienced, well, they certainly didn't come from privilege. There was a certain level of privilege they had access to in that time. And also because of the families they came from, even though they didn't have wealth, there were other things that they did have to offer, like, for instance, just, especially I think with my grandmother who's still alive and my dad's parents, really supportive families who, even if they couldn't financially support them, they were really there for them all the way through. And I think in both of those families, there was a desire to really put something excellent out into the world. And it didn't have to be about status. I think about my farmer grandparents who shaped me so profoundly. I mean, I still miss them. It's been, almost 20 years since they died, but they have often found their way into my writing because they just showed me how to show up in the world and be gracious to people and be kind and generous, whether or not you got anything out of it. And yet, obviously, there's another side to it too, right? So I think I've learned from my family that it's worth it to try to do things really well and to put things that are, whether it's relationships or art or something else. My family of origin, most of them have become doctors. My dad became a doctor and is one of the kindest, most generous people I know. And I think that's no accident that my siblings also became doctors because they had somebody to look up to who was not only doing his job really well, but just with an incredible amount of patience and grace and generosity and kindness. So there's that side of perfectionism that I'm actually really grateful for. I think I have a drive and sort of an innate commitment to doing things with excellence that I can't really take credit for. Like I got that from my family of origin and even as far back as my grandparents. And yet at the same time, obviously there's a flip side of that, right? I mean, perfectionism can also be paralyzing. And I think back to my own literary career and how many times I didn't put myself out there because the work just wasn't perfect enough. And, the times that I did, I had a lot of failure. I think anyone in the creative world does, right? And this is another thing I think we could probably talk a lot more about than we do is just how many times, for all of the successful people you see out there, how many times have they failed before they got to that point?
Right.
And it's really interesting to me how podcasting on day one forced me to confront that part of myself. And I am really grateful because I think it's been great to put work. I now we've won an award at the International Women's Podcast Awards. It's the Shure microphones. They did this award, Changing the World One Moment at a Time. And I'm so proud of that award. I'm so proud of, everybody who worked on the episode that was given that award, which is about one of our past trainees. Her name's Soraya Waters, and it was about the 6 months that she was homeless. And, that was her story that we helped her craft in that very first cohort of the Kasama Collective. And she helped edit the audio for it and really learned how to do podcasting by doing that episode. And so I'm so proud of all of that. And also, it wouldn't have ever happened if I hadn't just put it out there. I mean, I remember that submission process thinking, I don't, even then thinking, I don't know if we have a shot at this. I guess I'll just submit. And, the application fee wasn't too crazy. And I think of all of the times in my own literary career when I didn't submit things because I felt too shy about it or too insecure about the work or it wasn't quite perfect enough. And so I think it's always this tension that we live in as creators. I don't think it's a bad thing to want to do things really well with excellence. And also, sometimes you have to let good enough be good enough. And, as a good friend of mine says, who is also a podcaster, she always says, better done than perfect. And, I appreciate that reminder because I need that. Sometimes it is better done than perfect. Often it is better done than perfect.
What you're talking about really works with the idea you were talking about before about being vulnerable. Thank you so much for being on the show. I love listening to your podcast, and to be able to ask you to tell me about it and to talk about some of the things that you cover in your podcast has been such a treat. Can you tell us where people can find your podcast and find out more about you? And please list all of the learning opportunities for people too in terms of the Kasama Collective.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I just wanted to say that I feel exactly the same way about you and the work that you're doing, and was very excited about this conversation because I just think you're doing absolutely beautiful work, and it's really fun to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So Shelter in Place, you can find us. Probably the one-stop shop that I should say first is just our website, which is shelterinplacepodcast.org. You can find there links to our Kasama Collective, which is our live training intensive, which we are putting on pause just for this semester because we're launching the Kasama Labs. And that is, there's also a page there devoted to that. So you can check out both of those, the Kasama Collective and the Kasama Labs. I also think if you Google either one of those, it's the first thing that comes up, at least right now, for both of those. And you can find Shelter in Place episodes anywhere that you get podcasts.
Well, thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you. This has been so fun.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Laura Joyce Davis for being a guest on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. If you want to learn more about her podcast, go to shelterinplacepodcast.org. You can find all the episodes there, and you can also find out about the Kasama Collective and Kasama Labs. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian. The two additional pieces of music used in the intro were by Remus and Ketsa. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. One of the things I realized after this conversation with Laura was how essential community is, whether you're raising children or creating a podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, please get in touch on any of the social media or through the website. I always love getting feedback on the show.
What is it you want? I mean it. If you really got to choose, if you had a little magic, what would you want to do with your life? Sure, some of us would quit our jobs and see the world, climb that mountain or walk along the beach. But then what? Are there problems you would solve?
I raised money for the New York Food Bank, and I think we raised enough for 200,000 meals.
Wrongs you would make right?
We will say we don't want to take care of any of these things while we're looking at the consequences of not providing those safety nets, right? COVID didn't have to be this bad.
Whose forgiveness would you seek?
I was reading it. I'm like, I think I might be the villain of this story. I'm not on the team. In fact, I'm shaking the book hard. And I'm like, oh, no.
What wounds might you heal?
You know, I feel like I should just throw up a little flag here to say that one of the unacknowledged conditions of the American healthcare system is the way its bureaucracy itself is a wounding.
And what are you waiting for?
I feel held, I feel seen, and I feel loved.
Our days may be messy or complicated or broken, but they are ours. And I think we can do better, listen harder, and love more deeply. We can find our way to something more. I'm Annmarie Kelly, writer, teacher, learner. Wild Precious Life is a podcast about dreaming big, digging in, and connecting across distance, division, and loss. We are all hungry for those connections right now. In each episode, I talk with prize-winning writers, musicians, entrepreneurs, and wanderers who remind all of us how we can make the most of the time we have. So meet me here. Let's walk and talk and dream and discover what it means to be wild, precious, and brave. Subscribe and follow Wild Precious Life on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and get the first episode in your feed as soon as it comes out. See you soon.
Hey friends, we have officially opened enrollment for our next audio storytelling class, Labs Weekender. If you'd like to master the art and science of audio storytelling and create the kinds of episodes that you hear at Shelter in Place, but are sick of being on a screen, this course was made for you. Every week, you'll get a new module in your inbox to help you build a complete toolkit for narrative podcasting. We've made this course flexible for busy people, with audio tutorials and a private podcast feed so that you can listen and learn while you go for a walk outside. A lot of the exercises are designed to get you away from your screen. Our next class starts June 1st, so you can sign up at shelterinplacepodcast.org/labs.